Hello, and welcome to episode 310 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other posts. How are you this fine, chilly morning, Bill?
I'm doing good. It's not chilly in Florida. It's 80 degrees, but no sympathy for me, I'll tell you that. So this morning, Seth, I got a call. I've been doing a weekly news segment on News Nation, National News Network, on the incidents or the status of the war in Israel since that began, and ended up having to do a segment this morning on breaking news in a slightly less festive shirt, I will say. I put shirt and tie on that. And then, we try to stay laser focused on our podcast, Seth, and this is a World War II podcast, so we don't talk about what's happening elsewhere in the world, except when it's really germane to what we do. And, one of our commenters said, what the heck is a submarine guy talking about, all these ground wars in Ukraine? And I'm one of those odd submariners that have really been in the land battle doctrine since I was in the National Military Command Center during Desert Storm. And I got trained on campaign planning, ground battle, and did that for that, and post-Afghanistan did some of that as well. So as we get into these later battles in World War II, I really feel like it's my element. And the one we're going to talk about today is starting to get more involved with actual land campaign planning than perhaps some of the past ones did. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, this is a big one. And for all of you who are watching, you can obviously tell that there are three of us here, and we are always happy to have him back and always happy to have him here with us for any subject that we talk about. Jon Parshall. Jon, how are you this fine morning?
I'm, living the historian dream.
You just got back from Japan, didn't you?
Yeah, I was leading a tour over in Japan, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Kagoshima, and Okinawa at the end. And it's a great tour. It's super fun to be back in Japan. And so a good time. Still a little jet lagged, but we can do this.
Yeah, let's get it done because we got a lot to talk about today. Before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel as it helps other people find our show. We want to get the history to the masses, so please help us do that by liking and subscribing to our channel. And to those of you who have, thank you very much. So, the last time we left you, the massive armada of ships, all 600 of them, and men, all 127,000 of them, had left Pearl Harbor and points west and all pointed themselves like an enormous nautical arrow towards the Mariana Islands, destination, at least for this episode, Saipan. The Armada, the largest yet seen in the Pacific War, was bent on capturing strategically vital islands in the Marianas chain, planning to utilize the islands for future heavy bomber bases from which the Army Air Forces would rain destruction on the home islands. Marianas, specifically Saipan, were key to the American plan for the ultimate defeat of Japan. Saipan, the most important of the three targets, was seen to be the key, the toughest nut to crack, and the linchpin of the entire operation. Awaiting the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, and later the soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division, sat some 30,000 Japanese, a far cry from the 14,000 estimated defenders of this Japanese colony. The Japanese realized the value of Saipan, territory that they considered to be Japanese property. They realized the strategic resonations that would occur should Saipan and the Mariana Islands be lost. As such, they would fight as they always had, that is to say, tenaciously, and would exact a bloody toll on the American invaders. The fighting that would rage across Saipan and the horror of the final days would be a harbinger of things to come and would influence future plans for the Pacific War insofar as strategic decisions were concerned. The fighting on Saipan would leave an imprint on all of those who were unfortunate enough to witness the utter devastation and death that would permeate the island for the next 24 days. So, Jon, this is a huge operation, by far the biggest operation unfolded yet by the United States Navy in the Pacific. And this thing has far-reaching effects that go pretty far back insofar as planning is concerned.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And yet there's also an element of improvisation going on here too. So if you back up to the Sextant Conference that happened in Cairo in November of 1943, which was really focused on what's going to happen in Asia throughout the rest of this war. And Chiang Kai-shek is at this conference too. One of the things that comes out of that is the Joint Chiefs and the Combined Chiefs talking to their planners about, okay, when do we want to, capture this locale, that locale, whatever. And one of the locales on the radar screen is the Marianas Islands, because we understand that we can use these islands as bomber bases. You already talked about that. And so when the when the Joint Chiefs go back to their planners and say, when do you think you're going to nab the Marianas? They come back and they're like, we were thinking, maybe November 1944, maybe early 1945. And Admiral King looks at that and says, wrong answer. I want these islands a lot sooner. And he has an ally in Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, because Arnold has got this new bomber coming online, the B-29, and he thinks that this is the kind of plane that maybe can bring Japan to its knees by itself. And so he wants these islands pronto to be used as bases. And so King and Arnold then go back to their planners and say, let's speed things up, guys. And it's only in March of 1944, though, when the final ink gets put on the planning documents that, we're going to seize these islands 3 months from now in June. So this is the first time in history, really, where a land campaign is being put together for the express purpose of grabbing real estate that can be used for strategic air power. That had never happened before in history, and it's enormously consequential. I think the Marianas campaign as a whole is clearly the most consequential campaign of the second half of the war, and certainly in 1944. But that's where this whole thing is coming from. We want bomber bases.
No, absolutely. I don't think anybody would argue with that point. The whole point of the Marianas campaign was to get to these suckers and get a hold of these islands so these bombers could fly and deliver that strategic bombing campaign that the Army Air Forces wanted so desperately to have against Japan, that we knew also was going to fully, well, theoretically, weaken them to a point that would either force them to surrender or allow us to invade, but with a little more ease at that stage. So,
But John, this is kind of, if I could deconstruct that and ask you a question here, this is kind of an evolution of the island hopping campaign in the Central Pacific, isn't it? Because I think early on we believed we were going to hop islands just for the sake of crawling closer to Japan without consideration of using those islands for strategic air power. Is that appropriate? And then it evolved to, we have this new capability.
I think that's right to say it. And I think the other thing that you're sort of seeing from this is that the planners were still sort of in a 1943 mode of thinking where, if you look at the total distance that we progressed towards Tokyo during 1943, we made it halfway up the Solomons and we grabbed a few hundred more miles on the northern coast of New Guinea. At that rate, we weren't going to be in Tokyo before like 1961. And and there are people back in Washington that are aware of this, and King is one of them. And I think King understands that, okay, the going was slow in 1943, but behind the scenes, the correlation of forces is changing dramatically in that, we have this new carrier Navy now with all the logistical woof behind it, that we're not going to be advancing a couple hundred miles this year. We're going several thousand miles. We can do that now. So, yes, I think that if you were to look back at something like War Plan Orange, you wouldn't have necessarily anticipated that you were going to have a bomber in your back pocket that has a range of 3,200 miles. That's kind of a brand new toy to play with here. And King and Arnold both understand the implications of that, and the Japanese do too. They know about the B-29. They understand that if they lose the Marianas, they're in deep, deep weeds. And so they are determined to fight for it as ferociously as possible.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the B-29 is the game changer at this point in the war. And I mean, to your point exactly, the fact that we being the United States, can reach out and touch a target 3,200 nautical miles away from Pearl Harbor effectively, and just lay waste to it with our fleet, and then invade and hang out and just say, bring it on. That is something that was never envisioned in 1942 or 43 until after the Marshall Islands campaign, really.
Yeah, you got to put all these pieces together to make that happen.
Yeah, the war with Iraq, the code word was shock and awe. I've always
Right.
used strangle and suffer for this, right? So we were strangling with submarines and we were making
Yep.
them suffer with bombers. And,
Right.
it proved effective, but we didn't know that at this point in the war.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that preamble in place, here's the reason that this gigantic fleet is showing up. And the other sort of fascinating thing to think about is the fact that we've just pulled off D-Day in Europe, you know, a week before this. Think about the level of force projection that you have to have as a nascent superpower, which the U.S. is by now, that we can run simultaneous multi-divisional landings on two places that are separated by half a world. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I made the argument when Bill and I kind of set this operation up week previous. I made the argument that Overlord gets all the glory,
Yeah.
because it's the invasion of Europe and everything else. But Forager is actually, in terms of logistics, is frankly far more impressive in terms of the distance covered, the amount of material that's thrown in and pushed that distance, and the multiple things that happen as Forager unfolds. Not just Saipan and not just Tinian and Guam, but Philippine Sea, largest carrier battle in history, also occurs in the middle of this friggin' operation. None of that happens in Europe. None of that happens.
Yeah.
No.
So I'm not saying that Overlord isn't important, but this
Right.
is a
Only
little more impressive when you look at it.
Three divisions over 3,500 miles. And so
Right.
it's a big deal logistically.
Yeah.
All right, so here we are. We got an invasion fleet.
Yeah.
Let's do our thing.
So by June 8th, 1944, most of the forces that are gonna take part in this operation are in the area. Just like we do any other time we invade a place or planning to invade a place, we do a lot of softening up here. And because of the fact that it's out of the range of land-based bombers, there's only one thing that can soften the Marianas defenses up, and that, of course, is Task Force 58 under Mark Mitcher. And Task Force 58, John and Bill, they launch a pretty nasty carrier raid, and Mitcher does something that I think he's not given enough credit for. It's typical that when we attack a target, we do it at dawn. And knowing this full well, Mitcher is also aware that there are some significant Japanese aerial, pieces here at play. He decides to attack in the evening, and the surprise that he achieves here is almost totally complete.
Yeah, it comes in when they're not expecting it and just crushes the airfields on Rota, Guam, and Saipan simultaneously. And you think about that again from a power projection standpoint, that this force is powerful enough to attack multiple airfields simultaneously and just completely shut them down.
Yeah. Powerful enough to be he launches 208 Hellcats and 8 TBFs just over Saipan, Rota, and Guam and Tinian around 1400 on the afternoon of the 11th of June. These guys come in there and they just lay absolute waste they take some casualties for sure, but it essentially cripples Japanese air power in the region in one fell swoop.
And then this is terrible for the Japanese because their basic game plan is we're going to have sufficient organic air assets in the Marianas that we're going to be able to at least hold the American carrier fleet at bay long enough to bring our own carrier fleet out to play. And during this time, they're also anticipating shuttling more aircraft into the Marianas via, Yap and the Palaus and coming down north from Iwo Jima and the home islands. But the bottom line is that if the airfields inside the Marianas themselves are already getting torched and the aircraft there are up in flames to start with, you've kicked the leg of the stool out from underneath their overall operational plan, even before the Battle of Philippine Sea starts to take place.
Mm-hmm. The 208 Hellcats, Seth and John, don't confuse me, but I've always wondered what those 8 TBFs were all about.
Yeah, I don't know, actually.
It's got to be level bombing, right?
Yeah, we would think.
Level bombing in some... And well, there were the aerial commander, and there was also photo surveillance or
Mm.
photo
Okay.
reconnaissance, rather, not surveillance.
Okay.
So the TBFs could do that a little more efficiently than an F6F could, number one. And number two, as we said before, there was like virtually no intelligence or really piss poor intelligence when it came to Saipan, both photo recon and, we didn't know really squat about the terrain. And
Right.
that's what these guys are trying to do in these TBFs right now is they're trying to get kind of like a cram session, before the final exam. You're trying to get as
Yeah.
much information as you possibly can before they're going to hit the beach here very, very soon. And there's a little story we can get to in a little while about one of the pilots that gets shot down, a guy named William I. Martin from USS Enterprise VT-10. We can get to that in a minute. But following the fighter sweep, the American aircraft targeted shore installations and what few pillboxes they could see in any shipping in the harbors, of which there was very, very little. We talked about this very, very briefly, John. All three of us have been to Saipan
Yeah.
in the not too distant past. And even today, there are concrete bunkers, there are concrete blockhouses, what have you, but there aren't very many. There's not as many as you might expect. And the reasons for that are several, not the least of which is the fact that they didn't really have the concrete or the rebar to build a lot of these things because American submarines were sinking all the ships that were bringing this stuff over. So it was, they didn't have the time to prepare as well as they probably, well, certainly as well as they wanted to. So the fact that our people that are flying over aren't seeing many defenses, well, there's a reason for that, is because there's not that many there. A
Yeah.
lot of the Marines that hit the shore, they're talking about running into trenches, like World War I style trenches. And again, that just points back to the fact that we were sinking everything that was coming over there before it ever went over there.
Yeah. That's right. And that's a theme throughout all of the islands in this chain that because of that. Well, yes, the shipping campaign from our submarines is tearing their merchant marine apart at this point. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is the twin drives of MacArthur in the south and the Central
Mm-hmm.
Pacific Drive are constantly wrong footing the Japanese. They don't know where the next blow is going to land. So where do I send the ships? At this point, they're really behind the eight ball when it comes to doing the fortification work that they need to be doing, and they're going to remain that way throughout the rest of the war. Even fast forward to a campaign like Okinawa, same thing there. I mean, the Japanese were blessed in that case with having a lot of natural caves and also tombs that they could dig into, but they
Mm-hmm.
never had enough concrete and rebar, and that's because of the shipping shortage.
Mm-hmm. So, adding to their misery before we ever land is our old friend Willis Lee. Willis Lee brings his fast battleships in here, and we like to talk about the accuracy of Washington and Guadalcanal, and it was deadly. You called it, John, a nautical assassin, and she certainly
Yeah.
was that. These ships specifically were not as well trained for shore bombardment as were Jesse Oldendorf's ships. And we'll
Yeah.
get to Jesse Oldendorf in just a minute. The battle line, and by the battle line, I'm talking about all the fast battleships, Willis Lee's people, the Indiana, Alabama, South Dakota, Iowa, and on and on and on. They pound this sucker for 7 hours straight. I read that Washington alone fired like 460 16-inch rounds in one day. I mean,
Yikes.
it's unbelievable the amount of
Yeah.
artillery that is poured onto this target, but with not much effect, does it?
No.
Yeah. No, no, really none. Um, and again, yeah, if you haven't got good intel on where it is that you're shooting, combined with a group of warships, frankly, that have been focusing more on surface to surface action than
Yeah.
actually doing shore bombardment, yeah, the results are pretty paltry.
Yeah, and they really anything above ground mostly was shot full of holes, but a lot of the Japanese defenses, as we'll see, of which there were few, but still they were there. They're not really touched. But once Task Force 58 pulls out to go deal with, they got to go take care of some business here with the Japanese fleet. The fast battleships leave, and then Oldendorf's people come in, and they actually the accuracy does pick up significantly because these are the ships that, Bill, you talked about it. that these are the old battle wagons. These are the old dreadnoughts that have been trained to shoot, off Kaho'olawe, and these are the ships that have to essentially qualify, to be a shore bombardment ship, and they do lay waste, don't they? Though.
Yep. They, the indirect fire that they use is, they learned through experience that you can't shoot into it. You got to shoot, up and then down, and so that really proves effective here in ways that the fast battleships don't. Of course, these ships aren't fast, but they don't need to be.
Right. And yet the same phenomena that we see all over the Pacific is going to replay itself here. That, from the outside, it looks super impressive. And yet when, the metal meets the road, or the rubber meets the road, and the Marines go in, there's still going to be plenty of beach defenses left over.
Yeah.
One aspect that the guys that landed on the beach in Saipan all mention more than any other place that we've talked about so far in the Pacific War is Japanese artillery.
Yes.
Heavy Japanese artillery. And, the Japanese obviously possess artillery in almost, not all, but a lot of the battles that we've talked about so far. But here, there is a lot of friggin' artillery here. And it's all, for the most part, dug in on the reverse slopes of these hills that the battleships can't even see them, much less shoot them. And the Marines are going to pay a nasty, nasty price when they land, because this artillery pounds these guys for a couple of days. I mean, it really lays into them hard.
Yeah, that's right. They also have a substantial tank park, as we're going to be talking about. There's a complete regiment of Japanese tanks on the island as well.
Yeah. So there's a guy we need to talk about. We've only briefly mentioned UDTs, but let's talk about this, because this cat that takes command of this operation, a guy named Draper Kaufmann, is literally one of the coolest individuals to come out of the Pacific War, I think, ever. Not to mention he's got a really cool name. I mean, Draper Kaufmann is a great really cool friggin' name. It really is. Yeah. It really
Sounds like a character in Mad Men, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, Don Draper Kaufmann, who knows? Maybe that was the inspiration. So, we've talked a lot about the lessons learned from Baishio and in different episodes, especially at the Marshall Islands. But this is a direct result of that. The UDTs, how the UDTs come about. Let's talk about this briefly before we get into it. The UDTs play a very important role here, and they do so for the rest of the war by performing these very specific operations of surveillance of enemy shorelines and harbors and beach defenses and all this kind of stuff. The Navy had piddled around with this pre-invasion recon unit as early as 1942. They'd established a training school at Fort Pierce, Florida, which is actually where the UDTs were. I believe they were actually first formed, was Fort Pierce. And then following Baishio, the need quickly switched from recon to landing beach recon. They needed to see what was going on these landing beaches. A guy that we've talked about several times is the heavy impetus for this is Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. John, he's the one that kind of kicks this into gear here, though.
Yeah, and so now you've given me the softball here, where I actually have to credit Richmond Kelly Turner with okay, fine, he did a good thing there. He's still not my fave, but yeah, There you have it.
And that's all I'm going to say.
That's all I'm going to say.
Let me ask you a question, though, that we haven't talked about to this point. We want to credit ourselves, and we should, with the finally, we're doing something to do the recon of these beaches, and we quote unquote invent frogmen. But as you know, John, heck, the Italians have had underwater demolition people since 1940 in combat. And in fact, they were using compressed air. They weren't doing snorkel. So they were doing very sophisticated offensive operations using frogmen. But did we know about that? I mean, at this point in the war, was that still unknown to us?
Yeah, we had
because we seem to be trailing here.
Yeah, because, well, let's think about that. I mean, there's a famous incident, of course, in the Mediterranean where a number of these Italian frogmen team on little mini subs sneak into Alexandria Harbor as the battle fleet is coming in and attach limpet mines to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant and knock both of those battleships out for Jeebus, a long time. So, I don't know how much specific information we had about their breathing apparatus and that kind of stuff, but yeah, the Italians were actually doing very, as you say, leading edge stuff when it comes to using frogmen.
Yeah. And so it seems like we trailed the state of the art on this, and terror almost had to happen for us to figure out we probably need something like this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. To quote Turner directly in his Tarawa AAR, he writes, quote, "We must never make another amphibious operation without exact information as to the depths of water or without the ability to eliminate obstacles before landing," unquote. So he knew that we had to do some sort of recon because these coral atolls are not going anywhere as we're further moving westwards. This had to happen. So enter a guy named Draper Kaufmann. On April 20th, 1944, USS Essex ties up in Pearl Harbor following a refit in the United States. 300 passengers stride down her gangway. These 300 guys are led by a tall, skinny, bespectacled Navy lieutenant commander who looked like he would be more at home in a college classroom than at Pearl Harbor. 42 years of age, he was theoretically too old for combat. This guy is Draper Kaufmann. Let's talk about this, Cat. Bill, tell us about Draper Kaufmann.
Are you asking me because I'm a bespeckled Naval Academy graduate? I haven't been bespeckled all that long. All right. He was an absolutely fascinating man, Seth. He was an Academy class of 1933. He'd been denied a commission, and this did happen because of his terrible eyesight. Devastated, he worked for a steamship line, if you can believe that, before leaving the United States in 1940 to become a volunteer ambulance driver in France. He wanted to get into the war. And so he goes to France to do it. Captured by the Germans in France, he's released because in those days, hostages were actually released due to his American citizenship. And upon his release, promptly joined the Royal Navy. So France didn't work out, joins the Royal Navy and works in their bomb disposal unit during the Blitz. In 1941, Kaufmann was recalled to the United States, now that we know that he's got some skill in bomb disposal and bad eyesight and all. He's slapped into uniform, and once he's in the Navy, he continues his bomb disposal work and was very active in Hawaii following the Japanese attack. And I think he learned this diving stuff as the way to employ his bomb disposal skills rather than the other way around, Seth.
Yeah, that may be true.
I would.
He's also got a
with that.
pretty well-known dad too. His father is an admiral. He's actually one of King's anti-submarine warfare specialists out in the Atlantic. When things are going pear-shaped off the East Coast because of Operation Paukenschlag, King ends up relieving one of the area commanders and brings James Kaufmann in to be his troubleshooter in the Caribbean and get this figured out. So anyway, Draper comes by it honestly, and that he's got a very naval-minded family.
Mm-hmm. So his role for this Saipan operation is going to be pretty simple, right? Or at least in theory. He and his UDTs, of which there were going to be 3 teams, 5, 6, and 7, would recon Saipan's beaches and report on the tides, depth of water, and any beach obstacles they may find. Kaufmann himself would lead Team 5. He was eager for combat. He was ready for the operation. At least he thought he was until he talked to Admiral Turner. Turner, and I put this in the notes, and I thought you'd like this, John. He summoned Kaufmann to Turner's lair in April of 1944.
There weren't many admirals that had lairs, Seth.
Right. Yeah.
Richmond Kelly Turner had a lair. He had a lair.
Yeah.
So he shows, and this is funny, but not really, but it kind of is. So he shows Kaufmann a rough map of Saipan with an estimate of the reefs offshore. And Kaufmann is told by the admiral, quote, "I'm thinking of sending you and your people in there to reconnoiter the beaches and the reefs around 8, unquote. Kaufmann replied, "Admiral, it depends on the phase of the moon." Turner replied, "Moon? What moon? 8 in the morning, son, not 8 at night."
It's just, Turner is just one of these guys. It's like, he's not stupid, but he is stupid. All of this stuff is driven by tidal cycles, right? He should
Right.
know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. In
And the
addition to
point,
being a horrible
those,
human being, yes, he has some
and
real weak spots. Anyway,
John, your point is obvious to us, some of us, and for those that it isn't, right? Kaufman realizes he needs to understand the high tide and low tide divergence. And so it has nothing to do with the clock. That's the point he's trying to
right,
make to Admiral Turner. It has to do with we've got to go in there, at high tide when the moon is overhead and so the phase of the moon is right. And so this is one of those things that Turner should have understood without it having to be told.
right.
Mhm.
And
But
when
go ahead.
corrected on that, he immediately doubles down and, he's not
Digs
going to
in.
admit that he's ignorant about something. He's just going to send him in when he wants to anyway.
Right.
Yep. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the conversation continues. He says, Kaufman says, I don't see how it can be done in the daylight, Admiral, unquote. Turner shoots back. He says, quote, the main reason is you can see in the daytime and you can't at night, unquote, which I find to be ironic because Kaufman could barely see in the first place. And I mean blind, like he was blind as a bat.
No, I think he
Right.
put his spectacles inside his mask, so he had some ability while he's underwater. But you actually don't need to see that far when you're underwater.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the 3D UDT teams that are going to land are going to count for 14 officers and 86 men. The men would land the day before the landings at 0900. He said 8, but it actually was pushed back to 9. UDT 5 would examine the beaches off of Fetna Point, where the 2nd Marine Division would land. UDT 7 would survey the beaches to the south, where the 4th Marine Division would land, and UDT 6 was held in reserve. On June 14th, promptly at 0900, the UDTs made their way toward the reef, looking like, and this is pretty cool, really. They looked like men from Mars, according to the sailors that dropped them off, because they were painted they were only in swimming trunks, and are painted from head to toe in like midnight blue paint. And the reasons for this are actually pretty ingenious, and this is another one of Kaufman's inventions, so to speak. Every foot across their body were painted black horizontal circles, or rings rather. So when these guys are standing in the water, they can measure how deep the water is without having to bring a friggin' yardstick.
Right.
They were literally human yardsticks. So they can get in, do their recon, judge the height of the tides or water depth or whatever, and then get the hell out of there as fast as they can. So almost as soon as they emerge from their landing craft or these little boats that they're in, they're taken under fire by the Japanese. As they entered the lagoon for all the world to see in broad daylight, they were shot at by the Japanese machine guns and rifles ashore. Naval gunfire shifted ashore to provide some sort of protection, but it was lifted at 1000 because an airstrike was inbound that never came. So these guys are close to shore too. I mean, they're like 100
Yeah, they
yards
are.
offshore at one point, right?
Yeah, and for the listeners too, the waters off the Saipan, at least off these beaches, are very, very shallow and crystal clear. So
Mm-hmm.
these guys are super visible, even when they're in the water, and that provides some protection. But they're using machine guns and in some cases mortars and things too. So this is a very hairy environment.
Yeah,
Indeed, and they
I hope that we remember to talk about the casualty rate of these frogmen when we talk Iwo Jima, Seth. But here, I think they were, they were pretty lucky, but they don't stay lucky through this war.
Yeah.
no, they don't, and they do take casualties here. They get UDT 5 sustains 2 casualties, 1 KIA. UDT 7 takes 3 KIAs and 2 wounded, mainly due to Japanese mortar fire. And this is
Hmm.
again going to be something that the Marines are going to feel the wrath of for the next several days. By 0956, the frogmen are gone. So they do their job pretty damn quick. In less than an hour, they're in and they're out of there. Um, they report that the beaches are relatively clear, the water is deep enough, and the beach defenses seem to be sparse. Again, remember the artillery and everything's on the reverse side of the slopes. They cannot see them back there. Kaufman did note that mobile artillery was seen to be moving around and getting into position. The one thing he does note, however, and this poor guy, he keeps running into these stubborn commanding officers who don't want to take his word for it. he finds that the route that the 2nd Marine Division's tanks are supposed to come through is simply too deep, and that these Shermans are very likely to drown in the water as they're coming ashore. He finds a shallower, less obtrusive route for these 2nd Marine Division tanks. And he tells the 2nd Marine Division commanding officer, General Tommy Watson, known as Terrible Tommy. So that'll tell you all you need to know about this cat and how he acts. Watson ignores the ignores the warning completely, and he snorts at Kaufmann that he has no right to change the route of his tanks. And he says, Kaufmann holds his ground, and he says, quote, "They'll never get through there," unquote. They have a conversation back and forth, and this is a lieutenant commander talking to a major general. And apparently, from everything I read about Watson, is he doesn't bend on anything, but he does relent here with one condition. Bill, what does he tell Kaufmann here?
He says, Kaufmann says to him, I'm sorry, the general says to Kaufmann, young man, you're going to lead my tanks ashore. Yes, so it's going to be, you better be damn sure that every one of them gets through ashore without drowning. Out. And so, yeah, that's kind of a very impressive warning from the general. And I have a map here, Seth, that was hand-drawn map that was created from all of that recon that these dudes did. And you can see, imagine going ashore not having seen where these reefs are. Because look at the landing beaches, green 1, green 2, and green 3, blue beaches here, yellow beaches here. And so there's reef around many of them on the west side. The east side, not so much.
Yes.
And this was a big deal, and it was really good that they did this.
It was. And the 2nd Marine Division's tanks do get ashore, and Draper Kaufmann does lead them ashore, and not a single one of them does drown out. So he's actually, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, he's riding on the front of the very first tank as it's coming ashore. Yeah.
Point of clarification, though, some of those tanks don't drown out, but some of them are going to get knocked out because there are still 3 of them sitting off the beaches even to this day. So.
Oh, yeah. Yep. No doubt. So, D-Day. Saipan's landing beaches stretched some 6,000 yards long. They're divided into color groups. 2nd Marine Division would land on Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. Sound familiar? 2nd Marine Division, Bayshio. As well as Green 1 and 2. The 4th Marine Division would land at Blue 1 and 2 and Yellow 1, 2, and 3. So this is a large invasion front in terms of what we've seen previously as far as amphibious landings are concerned for the United States Marine Corps. These guys are awakened at 0200 and given chow at 4:30. The Marines had been in the assault craft, all 393 LVTs at this point for the initial assault waves, along with 140 LVTAs, and we're going to talk about these guys exclusively in a minute, which are the AM tanks, amphibious tanks, made up the assault waves of the 2 Marine divisions. Of these, the United States Army is going to be providing the vast majority of the drivers and crews to some 200 of the assaulting LVTs. You don't really think about that too often, that the Army is driving LVTs and ferrying Marines ashore, but that is exactly what happens here. And as we're going to see, the Army plays a huge role in the invasion of Saipan. So leading the way would be the 70 LVTAs of the 2nd Marine Division. Their job was to cross the reef and push inland. This is kind of a failed blitzkrieg, if you want to call it that, because their job theoretically was to push across, get inland, and then free the way for the infantry to come ashore. But, the LVTAs, they're an LVT, but with a tank or with a turret rather. And these things are large, slow targets. These are not nearly as maneuverable as a Sherman. They're certainly not as maneuverable as a Stuart. And they have a very high freeboard. If you look at an LVT, at a picture of an LVT, they have high, flat sides, which, what does an anti-tank round do to something with a high, flat side? It goes right through it. Yeah, exactly. And they're going to find out the hard way that these are not what they need to do.
Right. And on the Japanese side of things, one of the better weapons that the Japanese Army has in its inventory is a very nifty little 47 millimeter anti-tank gun. that you find these things all through the island campaigns, and they are perfectly capable of perforating a Sherman at several hundred yards, and they can certainly do that to an LVT. So, and there are a number of these guns, particularly right down on a little point of land in the Green Beach area that kind of sticks out between 2nd Division and 4th Division's areas. And some of those guns are going to really put a hurting on a number of these amphibious vehicles.
One of the things we just briefly talked about but didn't really get into was on that initial airstrike when the carriers are coming in and attacking the targets. We talked about a TBF Avenger. One of the ones that gets shot down is a guy named William I. Martin. He's a skipper of what they call the Buzzard Brigade, VT-10 on Enterprise. He gets down in a raft, and he's in the lagoon right off of Fetna Point. And he eventually gets rescued. This is the cat that gets rescued by the scout plane or the float plane from the USS Indianapolis, and he's brought back aboard Enterprise later on. One of the things he notices offshore are these little red and white flags that are all over the area offshore. For whatever reason, Draper Kaufmann and his UDTs did not see those flags. I don't know if the water was too high and he just missed them or what. I don't know.
Yeah.
But these things are everywhere. And it's pretty obvious as the LVTs A's and later the LVTs are reaching this area what these little red flags are. These little red and white flags are artillery range markers.
Yeah,
and we talked about it at the beginning. Exactly. And we talked about it at the beginning of this. The general in charge of the Japanese defensive area here is a general named Saito Yoshitsugu. God, that's a mouthful right there. But this guy knows that he does not necessarily have the opportunity to do a defense in depth here, not to the depth that he wants to. He also knows that he doesn't have the fortifications that he wanted to have, the concrete and rebar that we talked about before. He's going to rely on his artillery to do a lot of the killing here. And as we all know, artillery does most of the killing on a battlefield anyway.
Yeah.
He tells his people not to fire until they're given the opportunity of a target. And once these LVTAs cross that reef and they reach that point where all those little red and white flags are, that's when he unleashes the dogs. And it becomes very clear really quick that those little flags are aiming points for this artillery, because the artillery fire in this area is horrendous.
Yeah, a lot of those amphib tractors get hit as a result of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As the artillery gets closer, as the Amtraks get closer and closer to the beach, the artillery gets more ferocious and it gets more accurate. The Japanese artillery that had been virtually unseen by American eyes before the landings had been positioned, as we said before, on the reverse slopes of the ridges, they're pouring fire into these LVTs. There's a Marine that I took a quote from, a guy named Robert Graff. He recalls seeing, quote, LVTs were being blown up everywhere. I watched one take a direct hit. As the flash cleared, I could see bodies and pieces of bodies flying through the air. Survivors of the first 3 waves noted the accuracy of the artillery fire. 4th Marine Division veteran Keith Renstrom, who was a friend of mine, said, quote, it was uncanny how accurate the fire was. As soon as an Amtrak would get close to the beach, it was blown away. Always one shot, dead center, unquote. These guys are just bringing the heat down on these Marines. This is reminiscent for the 2nd Marine Division, guys. This is reminiscent of Tarawa. Not quite to the ferocity, but this is some serious stuff going down here.
Yeah. Although, that said, at least we do have amphibious tractors here to bring the troops to the shoreline, unlike Tarawa. So, yeah, I have a tendency to look at some of these direct first-person accounts and, every shot dead center. No, I guarantee you it was not like that. You're putting a lot of shells down there and some of them are connecting. But again, when you're at the tip of the spear and seeing the war through your soda straw, the effect was absolutely terrifying.
It feels like everyone was a direct hit. And these guys had to have been doing a lot of ranging and azimuth calibrating before the invasion even began. So
yeah, for sure. There's no question this is a big artillery park, and these, the Japanese know what they're doing here. But at the end of the day, Were they successful in fending off the incoming, waves of landing craft? No, there was no power on Earth that was going to prevent them from, getting ashore and at least pushing some distance inland, and that's precisely what ends up happening.
Absolutely. By 0843, 4th Marine Division Beachmasters reported that the first 3 waves had landed. A short 5 minutes later, a guy that we like to talk about, Jig Dog Ramage, who was flying high above the landing beaches in his SBD, reported that the 2nd Marine Division had landed near Afetna Point. Near Red Beach, 3 Japanese fire poured in the Marines from a brush-topped bluff behind the beach. Heavier fire came in from Afetna Point to their right, the ferocity of the fire startling the veterans of Bayshore, as we said. The ferocity of the fire caused the LVT drivers to veer towards supposedly safer areas. Sound familiar? Anything but safe, these areas soon became congested and blocked by incoming waves of Marines, making for ripe Japanese artillery targets. Again, Robert Graff of E-223 landed at Blue Beach 2 and took note of the fire and carnage, later saying more and more shells were pounding us and more tractors were hit. Bodies, both whole and in pieces, were scattered about. Men who were surely dying were floating offshore, surrounded by pools of blood, struggling to reach the beach, unquote. So this is
Yeah.
not, it's not that it's going terribly bad. It was somewhat expected, but the Japanese are putting up a significant fight here at the beach, guys. And this is some significant fire that these Marines are facing here.
Yeah. And again, that little point between the junctures of green 2 and 3, that point was not reduced during the evening. And so the defenses in there were continuing to take pot shots at anything that was coming into the beaches. You can, if you go and check out those tanks that are knocked out basically in the green 1 and red 3 areas up there. The one that's closest to the shore, it's about 100 yards off of, it's an easy swim out to that thing. And there is a hole drilled through the glacis plate of that thing, just neat as neat, by one of those 47 millimeter guns. And it's on the right front corner of the tank. So again, it's clearly from that point, which was just a hornet's nest of resistance during this initial set of landings.
And it was infuriating for the guys that are offshore, too, because I got a quote here from a guy named Captain Thomas Inglis of the USS Birmingham, CL-62. They had been part of the pre-invasion bombardment force. And again, we've talked about this before. Destroyers and cruisers could get a hell of a lot closer than could the battle wagons. And these guys are literally, they can see with the naked eye what's going on here. And if you're looking through binoculars, it's even more terrifyingly close. The problem was, he said, quote, "We tried our best to source the fire, but the Japanese, masters of camouflage, has concealed the batteries from observation. Try as we may, we absolutely could not source the fire. We had the power to kill them, but we couldn't see them. And it was absolutely infuriating," unquote. And you can only imagine how infuriating it was for the Marines as well, knowing that the fire is coming from somewhere, but they can't find where the hell it's coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about these LVTAs. We mentioned them briefly. They do, quite a few of them do get ashore, and they do move inland. But as they move inland, John and Bill, they're running into these anti-tank guns that you're talking about, these 47 millimeters and other ones that are making quick work of these things. Because with those large, high, flat sides, it's like sticking your finger through a warm stick of butter. Because once they're hit, they're hit.
Yeah, pretty much. They do have a tendency to brew up. The other thing that's happening too that isn't mentioned in as many of the histories, right behind those beaches, there's actually a fairly substantial swamp at the time. It's been drained now, but yeah, particularly in 4th Marine Division's sector, I believe, they get off the beach and then they move just, a few tens of yards, and now there's swamp and stuff behind that too, which does not make for easy going, even though you've got an amphibious vehicle. Again, it's very, very difficult to see who it is that's shooting at you, and you got swamp grass and all that stuff right in front of you.
Mm-hmm. 2 of the LVTAs, there are some that make it inland, though. They don't make it very far, but there are some that make it inland. Bill, let's talk about 2 of these guys. One of them is commanded by a guy named Sergeant Ben Livesey. The other one is commanded by a guy named Sergeant Onell Dickens. They make the furthest advance of these LVTAs. Tell us about these 2 guys.
Yeah, they do. Pausing along the side of the road, Seth, to confer as to what to do next, and alone without infantry support, by the way, which is kind of heresy. Livesey heard the clatter of tanks ahead of him. 4 Japanese tanks came rolling down the road directly at the 2 LVTAs. The Marines scrambled back inside their vehicles when Livesey's tank took a hit. However, the shell was a dud. They were lucky. Japanese machine gun fire rattled off the Marine vehicles as Livesey's tank knocked out 3 of the 4 Japanese tanks in rapid succession. That's pretty good shooting. The 4th Japanese tank turned around and ran. That's another rare event, Seth and John.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they wound up taking some pretty heavy mortar fire, and they're almost out of ammunition at this point. Dickens' vehicle becomes disabled, and the crew bails out. Livesey's vehicle is also hit, and his crew bails out. So all of the tank crews for these 2 vehicles get the hell out of there, and they pull back. As the Marines ran back to their own lines, Leo Pletcher, who was one of Dickens's crewmen, is killed. Both Livesey and Dickens would be awarded the Navy Cross for their foray deep into the Japanese lines. This is, at this point, the furthest penetration of the American forces and this is in their very early hours, or very early minutes, really, of the landing. And it should be noted, too, that these LVTA crews, most of them were ex-Sherman tank crews, too. These guys were pulled out of Shermans and put into these LVTAs. So
And just
far
think
cry
about,
from the Sherman.
Oh man, yeah, this is not what I want to be trading down to, is a thinly armored vehicle with a pretty low velocity weapon too, but yeah, them's the
Yeah.
breaks.
Yeah, it is, and but the fact that they knocked out 3 of the 4 in rapid succession, it proves that they were well trained tankers, and despite the fact that they're in these slow targets, which is what they are, these are professional tankers. So it's an interesting little sideline that I found there, that these were Sherman tankers that were pulled out and put into these LVTAs.
Yeah.
So guys, there's a guy I want to talk about that is a legend today, and he was a legend then, and we've heard about him if you listen to our Beachhead episodes. Henry P. Jim Crow. Jim Crow is still with the 2nd Marine Division at Saipan, and his story here of what happens to him. We all know who Jim Crow was at Tarawa. Crow was the fellow who was basically just holding down Red 3 for the entire 76 hours. He lands here at Green Beach. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, he's their commanding officer. He finds himself in a mess. A northern current in the lagoon had pushed the LVTs in his unit out of position and directly in front of Japanese anti-boat guns at Afetna Point. Embarked in the incoming 3rd wave, 2HCO Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pearson Jim Crow of Beachhead fame had a case of deja vu. Watching as his first 2 waves became entangled in each other and taking heavy fire, he was heard to say in disgust, quote, "Jesus Christ, haven't I been here before?" unquote, as he sees his waves just get torn to pieces here. Yeah. Bill, this is not a guy who's going to stand by and let things just unfold. He's going to take charge, and that's exactly what he does here, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I can imagine he's saying, I don't want Red Beach again. Give me Green Beach. That sounds good. And it turns out not so much. As his LVT hit the beach, Crow runs up to his leading elements, and he does what he did best. He gets the Marines moving. Fully aware that his unit was on the wrong beach and taking heavy fire and taking heavy casualties, Crow stalks along the beach, forging some sort of order out of the chaos, striding up and down the beach, standing upright again. Does this sound familiar? All 6 feet 6 inches and 220 pounds of him. He never flinched at the incoming fire, all the while admonishing his Marines. Does this sound familiar? To get up and get moving. So his bravado was no joke. Already a living legend from Beachhead within the Corps, the former enlisted man, now Lieutenant Colonel, had earned the Silver Star in Guadalcanal and the Navy Cross on Beachhead. This dude was the real deal, Seth.
Yeah.
Indeed. He is a bad
fundamental
man.
Huh? John?
was just going to say, I mean, he is doing what needs to be done, namely, you got to get off the beach. Everybody knows that who has any experience in these operations at all, that when you're on the beach itself, you're terribly, terribly exposed, and you need to get off there and push inland as rapidly as possible, even though that seems impossible when you're pinned down and under fire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He directs Crow directs G Company, his G Company, to move inland and to start doing something, and that's exactly what happens here. G Company is under the command of Captain Carl Hoffman. They move inland. He directly picks G Company because of two things. He can see that the Japanese are in trenches directly in front of him, and G Company, for the most part, not the entire company, but a great majority of it, are armed with Crow's favorite weapon, the 12 gauge pump action trench gun, the shotgun, the 1897 Winchester. The company had one shotgun for every two Marines and advanced towards the point, coming across open top Japanese World War I style trenches along the way. The trench guns worked like a charm, clearing a path through the trenches and blockhouses the Marines ran into. The Japanese in the blockhouses were eager to fight hand to hand for some reason. The shotguns made quick work of the charging enemy soldiers. Now, as G Company is punching through the Japanese lines, Crow decides to get up and see if he can find a better route inland. He takes his runner, a guy named Corporal Frank D. Natali. They head inland about 35 yards to scout the ground. Crow later recalled the action a deadly quail hunt, unquote, as he and D. Natali flushed out about a dozen Japanese in total and killed them all. Reaching a point where the two trails merged into one, Crow paused and looked around. It was then that he made his first mistake. He recalled, quote, "I was standing there waving my arms like a damn fool trying to get my Marines' attention when I got hit. The slug should have killed him, but the 1911 in his shoulder holster deflected the round downwards into his ribs and through a lung. Di Natale was also hit near his left kidney by the same burst that hit Crow. Thinking he was dying, he grabbed his carbine and plugged the hole in his chest with his fist. Every now and then, Crow would fire at the Japanese behind him to keep their heads down. Crow and Di Natale lay where they were hit for roughly 45 minutes before one of Crow's sergeants found him. Weak from loss of blood and lack of air due to the hit through the lung, he couldn't speak above a whisper. And this guy is so bad, I have to relate this. When the sergeant asked if he was okay, Crow simply winked, reached up, and twirled the end of his handlebar mustache. 5 dead Japanese lay around Crow and Di Natale, who was now unconscious. The Marines dragged Crow and Di Natale to an aid station. Mortar fire still falling on the beach, and a Navy corpsman who was tending to Crow was disemboweled by a blast, throwing everything inside the corpsman on top of Crow. Crow received shrapnel in his leg during the same blast. Helpless during the barrage, he lay on his back in the open, grabbed a pack and a poncho, and covered his chest wound as best as he could. A shell exploded in a tree directly above him and threw more shrapnel into his chest, his right shoulder, and his right hand. Hours later, Crow was lying on a transport offshore. He would most certainly live, as would Di Natale, despite the Japanese' best efforts to kill him. I mean, that is just a freaking man right there.
You know,
That's
Seth,
a hard day at the office.
We talk about
Yes,
the greatest
it is.
generation, but this is a prime example of why these guys really were the greatest generation. Now, it's not to say that folks in Afghanistan and Iraq weren't as brave and weren't as robust as Crow was, but my goodness, this happened over and over and over again in the European theater and the Pacific theater. These dudes were like a different breed.
Yeah. Especially Jim Crow. He was certainly a different breed of Marine, for sure. Yeah. So, guys, D-Day ends. As D-Day ends, things are picking up pretty rapidly here, John. As the hours are starting to wrap up here, we get a lot of Marines ashore in relatively short order, despite the furious Japanese fusillade that they're throwing at us here. We get a beachhead, and I mean, there's 8,000 Marines had landed within the first 20 minutes.
Yeah. Again, you're bringing, the better part of 2 full divisions onto this beachhead in the course of this day. The beachhead is not super deep. It's only about a half a mile at its deepest, but you've got a toehold, and better than a toehold, enough room to work with that you now can, start bringing the logistics ashore, bringing some of the artillery ashore as well, because that there's likely to be a counterattack this evening. This is just how the Japanese do things at this point in the war. That's going to change as a result of what happens tonight. But, on the Japanese side of things, it's clear that they have to put in a counterattack to try to eject the Marines from that beachhead. And we've got a regiment of tanks. And so the Japanese, Saito orders that regiment to begin preparing to move towards the beachhead to counterattack at this very evening.
There had been some, you said that there had been some advances, and there certainly had, and the Japanese are definitely coming. There were certain spots ashore that were won and lost 6, 7, 8 times alone. The Marines had advanced towards Cherincanoa. They'd set up that area to hold, and they'd started to dig in, as you said, John, knowing exactly that the Japanese were coming, and they were coming tonight. The casualties had been high. As night fell, most of the American dead lay where they fell. The Marine divisions had been so busy actually fighting the battle that they did not have time to compile accurate D-Day casualties. I looked, John and Bill, I could not find an accurate casualty report from 2nd Division or 4th Division on D-Day alone. They range upwards between 2,000 American casualties on D-Day alone. Have you guys found anything different?
No, that's generally the numbers that we relay to when we're doing these tours.
Yeah.
It is difficult to get the exact numbers, but bear in mind too that these are casualties that are within spitting distance of kind of what you see on D-Day too, at least for a given frontage of landing area and whatnot. This is a very, very fiercely fought battle, and the Japanese were trying their damnedest to repel them at the waterline.
So let me pull string on that, though, John. A lot more divisions landed on D-Day, right? So in Normandy. And are we talking about per capita casualty rate here?
Yeah, that's mostly what I'm trying to aim at. That on a per division basis, or on a per yardage of front, across a beach, that these are casualties, the same sort of ratios that you would have seen at a place like Omaha. Frankly, that the resistance is that stiff.
Mm-hmm. So one of the first instances we're going to see when it comes to some of the civilian population here on Saipan occurs this night, and it's a harbinger of things to come here. And it's important that we note it because it was a small event, but it's kind of like the flag is being raised on a tragedy that's going to occur throughout this campaign, and of course culminates at Marpy Point. Near the 01 line, some Marines dug in on the wooded slopes of the beaches, heard voices that sounded like women. Now, this is at night now. Word was passed quickly down the line to hold fire. It soon became clear that this was probably the wrong decision, however. Japanese soldiers had grabbed and forced Saipanese civilians, many of which who were Japanese civilians, mostly women and children, to march in front of them as they attempted to get in amongst Marine foxholes. As the civilians passed, the night erupted in furious hand-to-hand combat. This is something that's going to happen again on Saipan. It's going to happen all too often on Okinawa. And these are not, there are some Chamorros in these, human shield attacks, if you want to call them, because that's what they are. But it's mostly Japanese civilians, and the Japanese army are the ones that are doing the vast majority of this. And this is just terrible stuff, just absolutely terrible stuff, guys. And you're going to see over and over again on Saipan.
Yeah, no.
Talk about relevance to what's happening. Seth. Goodness.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese army is a terrible army, right? They are brutal to their own soldiers, and they're horrible to anybody that they come into contact with. And the same is true even of their own civilians. This is a thing that you see on Okinawa when we start talking about that. To this day, the Okinawans are incredibly bitter about the way they were treated by the Japanese army that should have been there to defend them and actually was abusing them in many cases. And this is the first instance that we see of that, and it happens on Saipan.
Yeah.
Using human shields and that kind of stuff, that was just par for the course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's as you said, John. It's gonna come back over and over again. There was a guy that I knew. I mentioned him briefly, Keith Renstrom, 4th Marine Division veteran. He was a gunnery sergeant in the 4th Marine Division. He told me, related a story to me about this very night, and this is one of the reasons that I pulled this out to talk about this. And it's one of those, there's a lot of racism in the Pacific War, but at the heart of it, I'd have to say that the vast majority of United States Marines and United States Army soldiers, they wanted to protect the civilians that were there. They knew that they were, for the most part, non-combatants, that they were just caught in the mix of something really, really bad. In this one particular attack, Renstrom is in a foxhole with his platoon. They're scattered out across this line, and they hear these people coming. They hear these women and children coming. One of the first people that walks into Renstrom's field of view, he's got a Thompson submachine gun, is a little girl. And he said this little girl was about 5 or 6 years old. And she just climbed into his foxhole and just laid there up against him as this fight is going on around Renstrom. And Renstrom was a killer. I'm not, going to mince words. He was a killer. He did not care if the Japanese was trying to surrender or not. He was there to kill the Japanese, and that's what he was going to do. But that night, he sheltered that little girl during the entire attack, never once fired a shot, sat there and held that child as this terrible melee is going on around him. And by the grace of God, he and that child were spared. They never got anywhere close to them that night. So it's a touching story. I remember when he told me that, it damn near brought me to tears because, of course, I have a little girl as well, and I know we all do. I can't even imagine being in that situation.
I traveled with him, actually. He was on our 2018 tour to Saipan and told that story. Mm-hmm. And then the following morning, that there were teams of workers that were coming through to round up the civilians and start getting them into internment camps so they could feed them and so forth. And this girl who had been in his foxhole all night long, she did not want to leave him. And when he was on tour with us in 2018, he broke down crying because he never saw her again. And he always wondered what happened to her. I think the odds are good that she made it through, but it's clear that, she really affected him. And he, even after 77 years or whatever it was, remembered her and wondered what had happened to her.
Yeah, it's terribly tragic, and unfortunately for Keith Renstrom, that's not the last tragedy he's going to see on Saipan. So, yeah. Japanese General Saito, we talked about it, or you talked about it, John. He was initially stunned by the massive amount of American men and materiel that are pouring ashore. However, he knows that if he's going to throw the Americans back in the sea, he's got to do it tonight.
Yep.
He feels that his best way to do that is to launch this armored infantry assault on the Marine Corps lines. He's got a pretty decent plan. It's just a matter of communications, which, as we've seen with multiple Japanese attacks and counterattacks, whatever the case may be, communications is their killer, man. It's their absolute killer because they don't have any communications hardly.
Yeah, coordinating their forces is always something that's difficult for them to do. They haven't got a lot of radios. Their signal corps is not the strongest. And, of course, they're also just running into the Clausewitz's friction, right? I've got this regiment of tanks and I've got a fairly respectable infantry force to go along with it, but I'm under American fire during this whole time. And how do I get those tanks mobilized and mate them up with the infantry that they're going to need to drive this attack through? Bottom line is, it's going to take them a lot longer to get to the beach front where they want to launch this attack than they wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wants to launch the counterattack that night, but to your point, John, it takes them almost to the damn dawn to launch this attack. I mean, they wind up launching it in darkness, but it's not much, not long before dawn. Their goal is to punch through the American lines. They're going to use the radio station, which is 400 yards behind the lines of the 6th Marines, as a landmark. His tank attack, as I said, would punch through the American lines, then fan out and destroy supply dumps and American artillery. Saito's infantry that he's bringing along numbers roughly 1,000 men. I couldn't find an exact number. They just say roughly 1,000 men from what I could find, from the 136th Infantry Regiment. The guy who's going to lead the tank attack is a gentleman named Colonel Goto. His tank regiment would provide the 40 or so pieces of armor. These are good tankers. Like, these are not, just some schmoes that are thrown in these Japanese tanks. These are well-trained Japanese armored units. These guys are good, but their vehicles are not so good, right?
Right. Yeah, even the largest Japanese medium tank, we're only talking, off the top of my head, this is like a 15-ton vehicle, and a lot of them are 11 and 12 tons. That in most cases are rocking either a 37 millimeter gun, or in the case of the mediums, they've got a 57 that's a low velocity. Um, these are just not vehicles that can stand up to a Sherman in a fair fight, nor can they stand up to some of the personal weapons that the Marines have, particularly in the form of the bazooka. Which, again, if we contrast specific with the ETO, by the time you get to mid 1944, the bazooka is really starting to lack teeth sufficient to take out some of the larger German tanks like a Panther, but against a Type 95 or a Type 97 in the Japanese army, a bazooka will do quick work of one of those things.
And we're going to see that they do indeed do that. I got to ask, and John, Bill, I want your opinions on this. Do you really think Saito thought he could throw the Americans into the sea, or do you think he just felt like he had to do something at this point?
That's a really good question. You read the accounts about Saito, and a lot of the surviving Japanese don't think terribly highly of him as a general. I don't know that he thought he was actually going to be able to roll up the whole beachhead, but I think he probably thought he could put a fairly substantial hurting on at least one of our divisions. And again, you have to harken back to some of the earlier campaigns that the Japanese had run in places like Burma and particularly Malaya. They had used armor very effectively in the Malaya campaign. And, in one instance in particular, the Battle of Slim River, the Japanese used a reinforced company of armor and a motorized infantry battalion, and they destroyed the 11th Indian Division, just basically completely destroyed it. So the problem is that if you're still in this 1942 mindset, hate to break it to you, but a 1944 era U.S. Marine Division with all of the bells and whistles, including armor backup, is a completely different animal than a 1942 era British Indian infantry division, and the Japanese are about to discover that this evening.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
Big time.
I think your point is that this does feel like a bonsai attack with tanks, right? And, like all the bonsai attacks before it, it doesn't matter whether it's going to work. They're going to do it. And so
they're going to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And it kind of starts, well, it does start off bad from the get-go. They're 4 hours late getting to the jump-off point. And then when they get there, there's a discussion amongst the two Japanese commanders, Goto and Suzuki, as to whether or not it's going to be a combined armor and infantry attack, or it's going to be this or that. And, these are points that should have been discussed long before they ever even got to the jump-off point. So, I mean, you would think that they would have agreed to say, this is what we're going to do when we get there, so let's just go there and do it, but they don't. But it's
right.
Regardless.
Well,
it's not going to end well.
Yeah, it's not going to end well. And the other thing I'd say is that the Japanese were not leading practitioners of combined arms warfare. In large part because they never really had an opportunity to do too much of this stuff. They didn't have large masses of tanks. And in those areas in the Pacific where they actually did have armor, they rarely had the kind of terrain that you would want to
Right.
do this kind of stuff. My guess is that if you were to look at, who were the better practitioners within the Imperial Army, it probably would have been those units in China that had some organic armor built into their formations. We know that they used it very effectively in Operation Ichigo, later on in 1945 and late 44. But yeah, in a place like Saipan, if these guys have not done any sort of unit drills together with this armor regiment, this attack is going to be a fiasco because they just don't know what they're doing.
And that's exactly what happens here. Beginning around 0330, the Marines begin to hear engine noises coming from the Japanese lines. The Marines knew that there were tanks out there. They didn't know how many were out there, but they knew that that the Japanese did have tanks. The Japanese had zero, big fat goose egg, zero noise discipline. None. I mean, the Marines can hear the engines. They can also hear the Japanese, one would assume the infantry, yelling at one another back and forth, clearly to probably coordinate themselves before the attack. They weren't even trying to hide the fact that they were coming. They were letting every mother's son know that they were coming.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what are you going to do? Again, that's an indication that these guys have not exercised together and that they really don't know how to put together a tank attack in the sense that we would understand it.
Right.
Exactly. So, Bill, despite hearing the Japanese in front of them, the Marines couldn't see them, though, could they?
No, they couldn't. The field in front of the Marine lines was pitch black, and then so was the night. Suddenly, flares blossomed over the Marine lines, and the fields in front of them were filled with Japanese tanks and infantry, some as close as 50 yards away, stretching all the way back to Mount Topacho, right? So that's an issue. Between 24 to 32 tanks flew across the open plain at the Marine lines. If the tanks are moving that fast, how can the infantry keep up? Marines noted that there were unusually large infantry formations, sometimes between unusual infantry formations, sometimes between 2 to 6 men riding on each tank. That's how they keep up. So they're riding the tanks. The Marines opened fire with machine guns, their orange tracers bouncing off the Japanese armor. The Japanese seemed to lack communication. They probably didn't establish phase lines either between the vehicles, as the attack had no cohesion. Some of the tanks stopped to let infantry off when appropriate to do so, and when they did that, they were hit by Marine rifle grenades. Those that weren't raced straight for the Marine lines, sans infantry support. So this was, as Jon said, completely uncoordinated melee. This is like Civil War. Everybody starts screaming and running, and somebody figure out who to shoot, kind of thing.
Yeah, I have so many questions about this because you see shades of, the Red Army would do this kind of thing too. You would have Red Army troopers on the decks of a T-34 as they're heading towards German defenses. The issue here being that Japanese tanks are so much smaller. As I think about something like a Type 95 light tank, where the hell are you going to put 6 guys on that thing? I can't even imagine. I mean,
On the
the back
turret?
deck of that thing is, I don't know. The deck of that tank, the engine grill is, it's no bigger than your Weber grill, so I don't know where you're putting 2 to 6 guys. Anyway, the bottom line is this is not a well-coordinated, well-delivered attack.
Yeah.
Not
it's funny
at
that
all.
80 years hence, but it wasn't funny at the time for either side.
No, not at all. Offshore, American destroyers are lobbing star shells into the night to illuminate the battlefield. Marine heavy weapons teams are moving from the rear to the front, bazookas in tow. These guys are bringing their bazookas with them. The bazookas are new to the Marines, relatively new, I should say. There were a couple that were on the Marshall Islands, but this is the first time they're really deployed in any kind of number here. Once at the front line, the bazooka men fanned out in pairs. one guy to fire, one guy to load. They went through the lines and engaged Japanese tanks, some at ranges of less than 20 yards. The Marines were so close that when these rockets would explode on the target, they'd blowing the Marines backwards. I mean, that is 20 yards away is close with anything. A rifle, that's close. That's stupid close with a bazooka.
Stupid close. Yeah, you don't want to be that close.
It really is.
That's
Hell
like
no. Hell no.
right? Stupid close.
Yeah. Danger close and stupid close are they're synonymous. They are the same kind of thing. So offshore, the cruiser Louisville CA-28 and destroyer Halsey Powell DD 686 answered a call fire mission and placed 8-inch and 5-inch fire on the Japanese tanks to the rear, back towards a little place called Cha-Cha Village. This is a really cool story. As a tank rolled up near Captain Claude Rowland of B-16, just yards away from B Company's OP, Rowland jumped from his foxhole and fired a rifle grenade at the tank from about 20 feet away. Rifle grenade exploded and set the tank on fire, but the vehicle clanked away. So these rifle grenades, John, they're not, and Bill, they're not going to penetrate too much armor. They're going to, at most, maybe blow off a track, maybe.
Yeah, if you're lucky. I mean, this is not a regulation anti-tank kind of weapon, but again, I have questions about how you set a tank on fire with a grenade launched at its exterior. But I'll accept him at his word. The bottom line is,
when they're refueling, right, the tank, and they spill some of that fuel over the top of the tank because they're not careful. Yeah, that's happened.
I couldn't tell you. Anyway.
Yeah.
Whatever works, right? If you can knock a track off, that's as good as it gets. But clearly he didn't, because this tank lumbers away.
Yeah, it cruises through, and it's seen by a couple of guys because Roland does get hit. He gets hit with shrapnel or something, and they have to drag him out. He does live, but they have to pull him off the line. And this flaming tank continues to roll through American lines until it runs up on a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, a proper anti-tank weapon. And the 37 millimeter pumps a few rounds into it and does knock it out. The 37s are also carrying, or rather, they have the ability to fire canister shot. As these tanks are rolling through, the infantry that are either being dumped off or jumping off or falling behind the tanks are now coming into the Marine Corps lines. And these canister firing 37 millimeters, much like Tenarue River, are starting to lay waste to these Japanese infantry as they're coming closer and closer and closer. One guy, Captain Norman K. Thomas, was ordered to take 36 men and some bazookas and head towards B Company. This is Rowland's company. As they did so, they came under Japanese machine gun fire. So this fight is not one-sided by any means. And this is what I want to talk about here, is that even though the Marines are really putting a hurting on the Japanese are putting some hurting on the Marines too. This Captain Norman K. Thomas, God bless him, was leading this unit up towards the front to plug the hole with his bazooka men when he's caught by a Japanese machine gun burst in the stomach and then takes a second burst in the head. His first sergeant later said, quote, "I could see daylight through him," unquote. This is, as the infantry is starting to get closer, some of these Marines, none of which, by the way, have ever come under infantry or armored assault at the same time. Some of these guys are starting to panic. And some of these Marines are starting to flee. And I mean flee, like get up and run towards the rear. Men recalled that the fight was, quote, "a madhouse of noise, flashes of light, explosions, machine gun fire, grenades, screams, and the incessant blasts of the 37 millimeter canister rounds." None of this, though, my point is none of this is starting to stop the Japanese. They're continuing to come. Their human wave assault is continuing to roll. And the fighting is going to, as it often does, especially here on Saipan, it's going to break down into hand-to-hand combat. There's this one episode where, as this one gunnery sergeant is heard to tell his foxhole mate, quote, as the wave is coming closer, says, "We don't move. We're holding this effing hole. This is where you and I are going to die if need be." The Marines eventually do. Yeah. And again, the whole greatest generation, where are these men born from? Yeah. I mean, that's a line, that should be put in a movie. So the tank attack does eventually start to break down, though. the Marines with the bazookas, specifically the bazookas, do start to pick these guys off one by one. And the numbers, we'd say, between 28 and 32 Japanese tanks are coming through, and they are being picked off one by bazookas, grenades. Some of these guys are jumping on the backs of these tanks, flipping open or pulling the hatches open, or if the hatches are already open, dropping grenades down inside of these vehicles. This one guy named Sergeant Dean Squires sees a tank heading for his foxhole. Realizing he had a demo charge in his hole, he grabbed it and waited. As the tank rolled by his hole, he jumped out of his foxhole, pulled the fuse, ran to the tank, jumped on and left the demo charge on the engine deck, jumping off the tank as the demo charge blew. Squires was thrown through the air by the explosion. He knocks out the tank and lives to tell the tale. And this happens up and down the line. You said Eastern Front stuff, John, and this is kind of Eastern Front knocking out tanks kind of stuff where these Marines are getting on top of these vehicles and taking them out by themselves.
Yeah, well, and this illustrates an important point. I think we as consumers of movie fare and that kind of stuff, you have this vision of, this tanks are all powerful, that you don't want to be anywhere near a tank. But the truth of the matter is that it's the tank that is terribly vulnerable if it gets into close range versus infantry, because the visibility in the vehicle is awful, particularly at night. And if you don't have effective infantry screening that vehicle from attacking enemy infantrymen, you and the tank are at a terrible disadvantage. And that's exactly what you start seeing here, that as terrifying as it is for those Marines to, have to look at an armored vehicle from a distance of 20 feet, if I've got a satchel charge or something of that nature and can rush up to that vehicle and get on top of it, I've got the advantage here as long as I don't get picked off by, some Japanese infantrymen in the process. And that's basically how these vehicles end up getting knocked out, one at a time, either with a bazooka or, a grenade in the hatch or a satchel charge or what have you. But, eventually as this attack unfolds, one by one, we're picking these vehicles off.
Which harkens back to your point about, defective formations and lack of combined arms, coordinated training, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, you've got to have screening infantrymen or tanks are terribly vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's how these guys get knocked out, is because they have very little infantry support. What infantry support they did have, they frankly left them in the rear.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do this armored push through these lines without any kind of infantry support, and it's only a matter of time before they all get knocked out. To your point about the effectiveness of the... Oh, go ahead, Bill.
It's kind of natural, though. You think you're scooting through the kill zone, and you're getting out of danger by doing that. And by leaving your infantry behind, you're actually increasing your vulnerability. So it's counterintuitive for folks that haven't trained on this stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. To your point earlier, John, about the bazookas and how deadly they were, one team led by PFC Herbert Hodges knocked out 7 Japanese tanks with their rockets. Other teams knocked out 4 and 5 apiece. So, these bazookas, while they were relatively useless against a Mark V or a Mark VI in the ETO, these things are nasty and they're deadly here in the Pacific, and they prove their worth right here. As the sun rises, the day's light reveals the corpses of over 700 Japanese troops inland of Red Beach. 1-6 suffered 78 casualties, and 2-2 suffered 19. The fight was it really was an utter rout. It was confused. It was a melee.
That's casualties, not fatalities?
Yes.
Right.
Well, I'm sure there are fatalities mixed in there.
Well,
The
point is, you're comparing the number of Japanese killed with the number of injured on the American side.
Right.
Yes.
So basically your kill ratio here probably is better part of 20-1, and you've completely trashed the armored regiment that is on this island at this point. Yeah, we know that Saito by the next morning understands that it's essentially game over as far as any sort of ability to launch counterattacks. From this point on, he's got to be on the defensive because his one counterpunch has just been wrecked.
Yeah, Yeah, and he knows that exactly. To your point, John, exactly, 100%. He's fully aware that now that he has shot his bolt, he has to just tie in like a tick, tighter than a tick, and just hold what he can, and hopefully the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Army will come to his rescue, which, of course, as we know, does not occur. So, wrapping it up, we're gonna close it out here pretty quickly. On June, because there's a whole nother episode we got to talk about these guys, but we just want to touch on it briefly here. On June 16th, General Holland Smith decided that because of casualties sustained by both Marine divisions and the stronger than expected Japanese resistance, and this little thing that's going to go down offshore called the Battle of the Philippine Sea, he wants to land the United States Army's 27th Infantry Division like now, because he knows that Task Force 58 is about to get the hell out of Dodge, and so are Turner's ships too. So he wants to get this infantry ashore. That's exactly what he does here. At noon on June 16th, 27th Infantry Division Commanding Officer Ralph Smith, Major General Ralph Smith, is summoned to Holland Smith's XO Graves Erskine and told to prepare to land two regiments, the 105th and the 165th. His artillery battalions would be brought ashore once the infantry was settled in. The 165th would land immediately and move into position on the 4th Marine Division's right flank and join the attack plan for the next day on Oslido Airfield. Nothing like giving these guys a little time to, I don't know, get ashore and acclimate themselves to the terrain and the situation that is about to befall them. The 27th Division guys, and I know you're both going to agree with this, as the operation unfolds, they get the shaft. They really do,
Yeah, they do.
from the beginning to the end.
And it's ironic
Yeah,
because
they were.
Holland Smith loved the Army. And,
Hmm.
he absolutely knew that the 27th was going to come in and rescue his Marines. That's what he was planning on.
That's what he
Or
was
was it?
playing on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, we're going
that's
to talk.
exactly what's going on.
We'll be talking next week.
Indeed. So there was general confusion, obviously, when the 165th lands, but they do indeed move up to the positions. Their attack towards the airfield would kick off at 0730 the following day, and the 27th Division would be a part of it. And we'll get to that in the next episode. So let's wrap up these first few days, guys. The landings on Saipan had been bloodier than had been expected. The Japanese resistance was also stiffer than had been anticipated. The tank attack by the Japanese wasn't a surprise, but the number of tanks was certainly a surprise. And this is something that we're going to go back to again and again and again. As good as the intel had been prior to Flintlock, it was that bad for Forager. The American intelligence, or lack thereof, for Operation Forager is, and we've talked about how Saipan was cut off from Westerners and all this other stuff. We know this, but the lack of military intelligence in preparation for this event is appalling, frankly, and it costs a lot of American lives, and including the dignity of one American United States Army general. But this is a travesty. We always talk about how good intelligence can be. This is an episode of how intelligence can be so poor, and it can have a direct effect as to the success of the next coming days. Would you guys not agree?
Yeah, absolutely. We're setting the stage here for one of the most miserable instances of Army-Marine cooperation, and a lot of it is driven by the fact that we don't understand the battlefield, and Holland Smith himself certainly doesn't understand the battlefield. And it's going to be glaringly revealed here in just the next few days.
Yeah, the intel
yeah,
failure
absolutely.
was really a Navy failure, though. You said a moment ago, Seth, that there was general confusion. So I guess there was admiral confusion, too. Dun, dun.
Well played. Yes.
Bad
Yeah.
joke. All right.
Yeah. I would agree with that for sure.
All right.
Regardless of all of this mess, the American beachhead was established. The lines were indeed strong. They had captured, or they were about to capture the airfield, and they were beginning to push inland. Supplies are pouring ashore, and the men thus far had dealt well with what few civilians, with the exception of that one attack that we talked about, they had seen to this point. The great majority of prisoners that had been collected, civilian prisoners, mind you, had been Chamorros, with a scant few Japanese thrown into the mix. The Chamorros generally were afraid of the Americans. Once they realized that the Americans were actually there to help them, theoretically, they were much more eager to
Welcoming.
surrender, as the case would be. The Japanese civilians, however, most certainly were not eager to surrender to the Americans, as we're going to see. This is all setting up, and we're leading in. And if you know anything about Saipan, you know what happens. But we're leading into this terrible, terrible episode that's going to occur at the end. But as nasty as the first few days fighting was on Saipan, with the artillery and the pushing through the beachhead and the cluster at the beachhead, the real fighting, much like at Batio, the real bloodshed is gonna unfold ashore once we get into the meat of the Japanese defenses. Guys, there's some places with some wicked names that are named, as I said in another episode, soldiers and Marines don't name things like, Rainbow Bridge or anything like that. They name it, Hell's Pocket, Death Valley, and Purple Heart Ridge. And that's going to be some of these places that we're going to have to talk about here in the next couple of episodes.
Yeah, no Unicorn Valley here.
No, there's just no happy spots.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Guys, is there anything you want to add before we wrap this first episode of 3 on Saipan up?
It's all good.
Yeah,
all right.
I agree.
Peace.
All right. Well, we got a lot more to talk about as we dive into the rest of the campaign for Saipan. And with that, go ahead, Bill.
Seth, I can't sign off without complimenting Jon on his shirt. Well coordinated, my friend.
Yeah, no, I was noticing that too. You know, that we've both got the luau vibe going on here, so that's good.
Yeah, I refer to it as Hawaii camouflage. So yeah,
there you are. Yeah, I blend in against my wallpaper.
You do, yeah.
People say that all the time. Every single time you're on, people make a comment about your shirt and your wallpaper.
Yeah.
No, I've come to peace with the wallpaper now. I think it's part of my personal brand. I'm just rolling with it. So
absolutely.
Anyway,
yeah, has to be. All right. Well, with that, we're going to sign off for this episode. We want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, tune into our YouTube channel. You know the name. If you got an email, if you have a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Paradon. I want to thank you all very much for listening and or watching. Jon, thank you very much, as always, for being here this week with us, and we'll see you in the next several weeks, right?
Yep. It's always lovely to be here.
Yep.
Outstanding. Bill, take us home.
Bill, see you again next week.